Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Medill tonight. We're very glad to have you with us during our celebratory centennial year for one of our terrific panel discussion programs. Tonight, we are recognizing Black History Month with a tremendous, outstanding group of journalists, all alums of Medill, and we're very glad that you're here to participate. If you have questions this evening, towards the end of our program, we will hope to get to those, and please put those questions in the Q&A area at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, we encourage all of you to visit our website, www.medill100.org, and there you will see listings of upcoming events, as well as a link to our Centennial pop-up store where you can get terrific Centennial merchandise. That store right now is only open till Friday, so if you're interested, please log in soon. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our Dean, Charles Whitaker. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Stacy. Good evening and welcome to the first of two programs that Medill is convening in the coming weeks in recognition of Black History Month. Tonight, we engage in what I hope will be a stimulating conversation with four distinguished alums, all veteran reporters who are on the front lines of covering civil rights and social justice in America. As we're all aware, we're in the throes of a long overdue national and some might say international reckoning with institutional and systemic racism following the killing of George Floyd. In the wake of the calls for dismantling of systems and institutions that have contributed to the subjugation, misrepresentation, and disenfranchisement of people of a variety of identities, but specifically people of color, many of our institutions are finally coming to terms with the way that they have contributed to maintaining those structures and systems. Media outlets are among those institutions doing some of this soul searching and navel gazing as they try to come to grips with, and in some instances, correct past failings with regard to representation in their ranks and their coverage. Our panelists this evening are four amazing Medill alums who, over the span of their careers, have been integrally involved in both the coverage and the conversations about race and media. Tonight, I want to pick their brains to get their perspectives on what it's been like to be at the forefront of this coverage, to understand how things have changed, if they have at all, in their newsrooms, and to find out how the way we think or should think about media's role and responsibility in this emotionally charged area of coverage has or should change. Allow me to introduce our panelists to you. First, we have Will Jones, who's a reporter at ABC 7 Chicago Eyewitness News, which he joined as a general assignment reporter in January of 2016. Of our four panelists, Will is the newest to the race and culture beat, which he was just promoted to last month. In his role, he works with a team of reporters and executive producers at all of the ABC-owned television stations to develop stories for multiple platforms with a focus on race, culture, and social justice. Will, who earned his bachelor's degree from Medill in 2006, also serves as a board member for the National Association of Black Journalists Chicago chapter, where he heads the scholarship program. Next, we have Natalie Moore, who's a reporter, author, and audio documentary producer who covers segregation and inequality for NPR's Chicago affiliate, WBEZ. Her reporting focuses on race, housing, economic development, food injustice, and violence. Natalie, who earned her MSJ from Medill in 1999, has had her work featured on the BBC Marketplace, NPR's Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition. She's the author of The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation, which won the 2016 Chicago Review of Books Award for nonfiction and BuzzFeed's Best Nonfiction Book Award in 2016. She's also co-author of The Almighty Black Peastone Nation, The Rise, Fall, and Resurgence of an American Gang, and Deconstructing Tyrone, a new look at Black masculinity in the hip hop generation. I'm also happy to say that Natalie is a colleague because she's an adjunct faculty member at Medill. Robert Samuels is a national political enterprise reporter for the Washington Post. In that role, he travels the country to chronicle how policies, political figures, and prominent issues in Washington affect the lives of everyday Americans. Robert, who earned his BSJ in 2006 as well, was a finalist for the 2019 Toner Prize for National Political Reporting, the nation's premier political reporting award, for a series of profiles about presidential candidates and the Black experience. He spent 2020 examining the role of race in health, politics, and community. Robert also has the distinction of being the only Northwestern student to have served as editor-in-chief of both the Daily Northwestern, the Evanston and campus paper of record, as well as Blackboard magazine, a publication focusing on Northwestern's African-American student experience. He followed me by decades as Blackboard editor. Finally, we have John Eligon, who's a national correspondent for the New York Times covering race. John, who earned his bachelor's degree from Medill in 2004, is based in Kansas City, Missouri. His work documents the nuances of America's struggle with race issues, from the protest movement over police violence to the changing face of the nation's cities and suburbs. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope I haven't put you on the spot by saying this is going to be an engaging conversation, but I know that you are going to live up to that billing. Let us start by having each of you kind of trace how you got to this coverage. And I'm going to start with Will, because you're the newest person on this beat. And I was curious to know if this happened because you lobbied to have this beat created. Did the folks at WLS decide in the wake of all that was happening that they wanted to create this beat? What's the story behind how you came to this coverage?
Well, this was in response to the national conversation happening across the country involving race. A lot of television stations, including ABC, felt that they needed to do a better job covering race. So they started a race and culture unit, which means that they have reporters in each of their 8 stations across the country covering race and culture. So I started this role last month, but I've been covering race and culture throughout my career. And I think over the past year, that has been the topic of conversation with the pandemic, how race is affecting who gets treatment, who gets vaccines, who is becoming infected, and then with the police brutality, which has been an ongoing conversation in Chicago for years.
Did you specifically ask to have this beat, or did you raise your hand, or did they tap you on the shoulder?
Once I saw that this was a possibility, I decided to apply for it. I remember I was on the south side of Chicago. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was covering another child shot and killed. And I was trying to reach out to family members in front of the emergency room, trying to get a picture, trying to get some sound before a live shot. And one family member tried to attack me, and the police had to get involved. And then I realized, what am I doing? I am trying to get a picture, get sound to meet a deadline, but that doesn't really change the reality for these families. And I often felt that a lot of times with crime coverage, that it became background noise. So I would go into these neighborhoods and report on crime and then leave and never put it into context of like what is causing it. So I just wanted to be a part of the solution. And that experience was a wake-up call for me that I needed to do more.
Natalie, I'm a longtime listener of WBEZ. I don't recall there being a race beat before you took it, and you launched the Southside Bureau as well, correct?
Yeah, so I have found ways to cover race without being called a race reporter because the appetite, it ebbs and flows. So I would say I'm glad you didn't ask me first. I was sitting here thinking, okay, how did I do this? Medill really helped me want to focus on urban affairs. The urban affairs class, and then shout out to Donna Laff, who really introduced me to public policy. And that for me was, okay, this is what I want to do. It was by default about race, because if you're covering a city, these are the issues. So I always saw myself as an urban affairs reporter. And when I went to the St. Paul Pioneer Press, I was covering inner ring suburbs, which had some, they were like neighborhoods. Yeah. And I would say like the policy nerd in me really came out then because, the conversation has changed even in the past decade about housing segregation and all these systemic forces. This wasn't talked about. Most of us, I would imagine, didn't learn this in school. So my introduction was sprawl.
Yeah.
So why are we building all these suburbs when the urban core is deteriorating and you have to build roads? So that was the beginning of it for me. And then, so I was able to look at, suburbs playing a role in the region. And then I went to the Detroit News and covered Detroit City Council, which was the political beat. But Detroit is a great news town. So many stories, so many urban challenges that are there. So I was able to do that there. And then with WBEZ, we were called bureau reporters. And I can't think of any newsroom in the country, no matter the medium, that had bureaus within the city. And so North Side, South Side, and West Side. And even though that wasn't called the race beat, that's what we were doing. Yeah. And then a couple of years ago, they changed our team name to Race, Class, and Communities. And I would say that our focus as a team and with our editor, it's less identity driven and more policy driven, using data to tell the stories, and then, putting lived experience to that data. So that's what the team is called now. In 5 years, it could be called something else, but the work that I do is still the same.
Is it still based out of the Chatham? I'm nothing.
Yes.
Yes. Everything's
yes.
virtual now.
My office is still there. Yeah, on 75th Street. We don't have North Side anymore, but we have West Side in Little Village.
Whose decision was it to base it to put a bureau in Chatham, which was once upon a time a Black middle class enclave? I mean, whose decision was that, and how did that?
Oh, originally I was in Inglewood. So those decisions were made before I came. So everybody who's in the bureau has never left WBEZ. I guess we're gonna, ride it till the wheels fall off. And from what I hear, there was some, I don't want to say controversy, but concern. I mean, any neighborhood you put a bureau in, there's going to be, why didn't you pick this neighborhood? So some people felt like, oh, so you're using the poor Black neighborhood as the proxy. Yeah. But that's not, I don't think, entirely fair, because Inglewood is more than that statistic. There are middle class and working class people who live there. That bureau had a lot of mold and some issues with the landlord. And when we were looking at moving, I said we should be on 75th Street, straddling Chatham and Park Manor. And there are so many, for those of you who have been able to venture out, there's so many businesses that are there. When we were in Inglewood, there wasn't much around on that strip. So now we have, Lim's Barbecue is across the street, Brown Sugar Bakery, Five Loaves, So Vegetarian, Francis's. So there's a lot more feeling that you're part of a community by being there.
John, it feels as though your role has evolved over time. You were originally, Midwest Bureau writ large. It has evolved into coverage of race. How did that happen?
Yeah, so I came to Kansas City to cover the Midwest back in 2012, and that entailed covering 6 states. So it's basically covering anything that happens. And like the other panelists, I too covered issues of race before it was officially on my beat per se. Because of the fact that, race is, and basically it plays a role in basically every facet of society, right? So how can you cover anything without covering race? And so what happened was in 2014, we know that in Ferguson, Michael Brown was killed by a police officer, and that started, I guess the movement that we see continuing today, the Black Lives Matter movement. And so that was in, because I live in Kansas City, St. Louis, I would cover stuff that happened in St. Louis anyway. So that was square in my territory that I covered. So I went out there, and, my wife is from the area too, from the region. So I'm very familiar with the region. So I was covering, Ferguson and Mike Brown for, months on end after that happened. And after that happened, we saw that was a prevailing conversation. It really changed the conversation around race in America. And we really saw a conversation on race that we hadn't seen, arguably since, maybe the 60s. And you could even argue maybe a little bit after Rodney King. But, just the way that it had changed society, and the way it had impacted people in different ways and got people talking about race in new ways. The editor said, hey, let's really create a team to cover race. And then out of that was born a kind of a small team of reporters and editors whose focus was on race. And that was back, around 2015 or so, 2014, 2015. And over time, people have moved on to different jobs and things like that. So now, now I'm just I'm a national correspondent who now covers race. We still have like a race-related product at the New York Times, so it's a newsletter, and we're trying to do some other things with that as well. So we still have that brand there. But as far as my beat, I'm the national correspondent who covers kind of all aspects of race, which is pretty daunting in the sense because, like I said, race is in everything. I mean, it's in everything. So I could be a business reporter one day, I could be a health reporter the next day, I could be a crime reporter the next day. So yeah, that's how I've really gotten to this point.
And Robert, your role too has evolved, and it's not race specific, though you have managed to make it a lot about race by choice or accident. I don't know if that's intentional.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was. I mean, this is racism being America's original sin and the original stain of the place. It just sort of follows you. And honestly, it began following me when I was a student at Northwestern. The reason I started covering issues of diversity was because when I was a freshman, folks were walking outside of their dorms and seeing the N-word scrawled across their dorm room doors. And at that point, I was in 201 and failing, and the Daily Northwestern had an editorial that said, we don't really know what we're doing, and we need more Black reporters. And I needed the experience, and that's what I did. And as time has gone on, I think this has become a continuing issue, that the issues that I saw in the Daily Northwestern, when I joined campus, they resonate and they're replicated in news organizations wherever I went. And more specifically, this year and in the previous years, when race became such a big part of the political discussion because of where Donald Trump had led the country, had led the Republican Party, and where Democrats thought what they needed to do to win, there were very important questions to be asked from candidates about the racial question. And it really struck me that none of my colleagues were asking them, but I wanted to know the answer. So that's led to where we are today, which is a time in which this issue is coming up and there are questions to be asked and few reporters to ask those questions.
How has your identity as African Americans affected your coverage, or has it affected your coverage? What does it bring? What do you bring to the table? Or do you think about it? I mean, how do you process that as you are reporting? Anyone can take it, but I'd like everybody to kind of weigh in. You want to call someone? Will, take it first.
So when the unrest was happening across the country, it happened in Chicago. And I remember being in the middle of chaos, a lot of officers on the streets, people looting, people walking through the streets after curfew. And at that time, I was at first a journalist, and then throughout the night, I became a person. And when you have a lot of time on live TV to fill, you start speaking about your personal experiences. And I remember thinking at one moment during that coverage, realizing that I have a responsibility. I was placed in this position at this moment for a reason. And as a Black man reporting in a major city like Chicago, when it's complete chaos around me, I have a responsibility to bring that perspective to the viewers. I was thinking of not only about the viewers on the southwest sides and north sides of the city, but the inner suburbs and the collar counties. How are they processing this information? And I understand that some of those viewers, could be the only Black person that they have day-to-day experience with, not personally, but through television. So I use my experiences in life, interacting with the police. I use my experiences connecting with other Black men and their knowledge and their interactions with the police, and started to share those stories and try to describe what was happening. So people were seeing property destruction, but what was causing that? So I made it a priority throughout the night to remind viewers, these people, these demonstrators, not all of them, but most of them, they're out there because they're angry. And I tried to keep that in mind throughout the coverage of the night. So I brought my experiences as a Black man directly to my coverage.
Robert, I seem to, you've written about experiences where you've had actually encounters where race has been a factor in your interactions with people. People have been surprised that you were a Black reporter. But again, how has race kind of affected you and the way you approach the beat and the coverage?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of places where I go to, I'm often the first Black person in town, or if not in town, then the first Black person to sit at someone's house and talk to them about issues that matter. Maybe sometimes the first Black person to ever drink coffee from one of their cups. And that's something that I try not to think about too much, because if it does, it would drive me a little nutty. What we know about journalism and the active reporting is that you're never going to be exactly like anyone who you speak with. And so race is one of those things that's a difference between me and a lot of people who I talk about. And in times when I have covered Black communities, you know, there have been times where I've spoken with folks on the phone and they've answered the door and they're surprised to see that this voice came out of a person with this skin. You know, there have been times where I've been confused for being an undercover police officer or a person who's working with the Department of Children's and Families. So, you know, covering the Black community is not particularly a crystal stair either when it comes to ease of coverage. But I think one of the things that the past 5 years has really taught me in terms of dealing with the politics team and a big team like the one at the Washington Post is that perspective and the ways you look at things matter. Now, one of the things that I've often noted is that when we're talking in meetings about issues about the Black community or Black voters, it's always seen, they're always seen as objects of the politician, you know, a group they have to woo, a niche market, something special added that if they do their jobs, they might be able to get some Black voters too. What that does is it really disembowers a very powerful voting bloc, right? And so a lot of the questions that I ask in meetings and a lot of the stories that I've pursued come from almost an accountability lens, that if you're a person who's running for president, you might need to have a story explaining what your interactions with the Black community were, not in sort of the we are the world, Sally Struthers way of thinking about things, but actual policies and actual lived experiences. And so I think it became very clear to me that those sorts of ideas and those sorts of questions come from the fact that I don't see myself as an object to be won. I see myself as an active person. And I think adding that perspective helps.
Natalie, how has identity, your identity as a Black woman, affected and or shaped your coverage, if it has at all?
Yeah, it has. And I would say being from Chicago, being from the South Side, gives me the institutional knowledge, and, you know, things just click automatically in some ways. But, you know, I have this lived experience of home ownership and racism. You know, all of the bad things that happened to Black people during the crash happened to me. You know, one of the best compliments someone told me was like, this is my story. I just didn't have the language for it. So that sticks with me. And, you know, that's, you know, we're not monolith. There are all types of things, you know, that happen in communities. I also think that the medium of radio or audio allows for intimacy. So we can use first person. That doesn't mean that I'm doing essays.
Right.
But we can insert ourselves in stories. And I have a story airing this week. I didn't know what it was going to yield, but this is just a very recent salient example. There's a lot of anxiety right now in Chicago about carjackings. The numbers are off the chain. And so I went in thinking and they're all over. It's not just in Black neighborhoods. So I thought that would be the story. But I interviewed this scholar who's very, community oriented, but that ended up not being the most important part. Like her kids' daycare, another mom was carjacked. So she's like, this is my name. Like, what is a Black mom to do? And so it really turned into Black moms responding, and that's not what I set out to do.
Right.
And she's also teaching like this feminist class about motherhood in an urban context. So all of that got layered in, and I'm a Black mom. And the managing editor was like, oh, so don't, because it's very hard to sometimes turn our audio stories into digital stories. So she was like, well, why don't you just write in, like, take that and make it more perspective, like more of a column, still with the interviews and still with the point, a lot of people made the point of, let's not make bad public policy that's a knee jerk, because that got us things, like the crime bill. And, we know better now than we did 25 years ago. So that, definitely spoke to my experience, which is not just why I did the story. I mean, it's all over, like everybody's talking about the carjacking. And I was like, oh, we haven't done anything at BZ beyond the numbers. So let me try to tap into some of this anxiety, but it's also something that I could tap into for myself.
Yeah. John, what about you?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me is, so I was born in Trinidad, the best island in the Caribbean. And
I'm not going to let you and Robert get into this Trinidad versus Jamaica.
Not today.
Not today. We'll save that for another day.
and so obviously, like, my identity and upbringing with Blackness is very, in some ways, very different than the African American experience. I moved to the U.S. when I was 6, but still, I grew up in a Black Trinidadian household, with Trinidadian values. Most of the places when I went to high school and stuff, there were not many African Americans there. It wasn't until Northwestern where we had the huge 5% Black population that I was really surrounded by a large African American population, and at least that was my world at Northwestern when I was there. So I think what that's helped me see is, like, bring this perspective to reporting on race. That I think is often missed in reporting, which is the diversity of Black communities, right? It's often seen as, like a monolithic experience to be Black in America. But the reality is, there is this sense of Blackness in America that you don't get in other places, where if you're an immigrant from Ghana, if you're from Trinidad, if you're, from wherever, you are automatically within the tent of Blackness, right? But within that tent, there's just many different experiences, many different backgrounds and things like that. And so I really try and, like, bring that perspective, having had that perspective myself into my reporting. So on the one hand, while being a Black man growing up in America, I have experienced, some of the issues that you experience as a Black person growing up in America. I also, not coming from that upbringing, so when I go into any situation, any story, and I'm trying to tell someone's story, I do come with that, sense of curiosity and, like, what brought you to this point in your life? So I still think bringing that curiosity and bringing that, being an insider, but also bringing an outsider's curiosity and outsider's perspective also kind of helps. It informs my reporting in a big way.
Mm-hmm. Have there been impediments inside of your newsrooms? Have you had to fight for stories that editors have not wanted you to do? And how have you navigated that and convinced them that this is a story that's worthwhile? Anybody?
I mean, I'll just start for me. I mean, there's definitely been times where you have to do more convincing or telling, convincing people that, a story merits, like, more attention than it gets. And oftentimes there's pushback in the details, right? And, when you write a story, I have experienced, there has been the sense sometimes when you write stories about, racism and whatnot, it's like, oh, well, what is that other side? Like they must have done something for the police to have reacted that way. And you really have to justify someone's experience in a way. And to me, that happens, with regularity. I think with this reckoning that the country's having right now, which is also happening in newsrooms, I would say that that's changing a little bit, that we are seeing editors and people in power in newsrooms starting to understand more that, yes, you can still do very rigorous reporting without diminishing someone's experience and without having to take the official response from the police or from whatever, white figurehead and white person in authority, having to take that as, like, the ultimate authority, right? You can validate the experiences of these people in Ferguson, for instance, who for years had been complaining about being stopped by the cops for no reason, being put in handcuffs and stuff like that. And then, suddenly Michael Brown gets killed, this blows up, and you hear all these stories, one of which happened to my father-in-law in that same area, getting unlawfully arrested and stopped by the cops. So it's these types of things that you have to fight to justify experiences that I think is a constant and a continuous battle, but one that I hope and I think is changing somewhat.
Robert, were you gonna say something?
I wanted to hear what John had to say. For me, I don't find much impediment. And I think one of the reasons is that when I try to choose stories, I try to make sure that I have characters that speak to a universality of the human experience that helps make things a little bit more palatable to the white editors in my office who might not necessarily see it in the same way. I am a very mission statement focused journalist. So I usually go into a story meeting saying, this story is about loyalty, or this story.
So you head off the objections in advance by sort of framing the story in a way that you think will sell it to editors.
Yeah. I mean, I would never put it in such language, but
well,
yes.
Yeah, essentially, yeah. Natalie, Will, any examples, any thoughts?
I would go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, I worked for Gannett. I worked for Knight Ridder. It was much harder in corporate media. Coming over to the nonprofit side, not that there aren't issues. There is no pressure with advertisement.
Right.
Trying to get audience is different with our model, and our audience tends to, it's like not geographic based, like, oh, well, just because we have a lot of support from the North Shore, it doesn't mean that that's where we should do our coverage. And in fact, I don't think that's what the North Shore would want from us. So I never have any problems with that, like I did earlier in my career, negotiating or trying to come up with euphemisms. I do think the thing that our newsroom has to push back on, and I think this is universal, is how not to center whiteness in stories or make whiteness the default and not, the white gaze being used for a story. So
yeah, I'd like a bit more. Give me an example.
So if if I was doing a story, and this often isn't with my editor or any of the editors I've had over the years, but let's say other folks in the newsroom are brought in, or digital, talking about treatment. And I remember it was something about the Obama Presidential Center in Woodlawn. And it was like, oh, so let's put a map where Woodlawn is. Like, no, that's like, get your own map. Like, let's not. Well, and it's always like, well, with someone in Winnetka, I don't care if someone in Winnetka doesn't know, then let them learn. So I'm always, and that's what I tell younger journalists too, like, just keep trying to sneak stuff in. And eventually some editor is going to forget or not catch it. A small example, I said a man in the story, and the editor was like, it's a man. I was like, not in this context. It's not, it's a man. So it's very little things. And so for me, I always want people, and I get like, we're all mainstream. And so you have to, and I'm not even that, so I know this has got to be harder, like for the Post and New York Times, because it can be all kinds of varied people who are consuming. So you have to strike this balance. And I felt that more strongly in newspapers than I do now. But I always think about, I want people to see themselves in the story and that it's for them and not about them. Even when it's well-meaning. When I was in Minnesota, there were more Somalians coming to town. And so those stories were written more like an anthropological, like, here's what they eat, and here's, because most people didn't know. Like, I get that, this was 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And so how do you write that people see themselves, but you're also maybe educating people who don't know. So
But
it's,
you're not making them the other, the sort of exotic other.
Right.
So you write about them in a way that is that humanizes them, it educates the reader, but again, doesn't make them this object.
right.
No, that's fair enough. Well,
I think one of the things that I struggled throughout my career, I remember going to Medill and graduating and wanting to do stories that matter. And as a general assignment reporter, I quickly learned that you really don't have the time. You're focused on crime, politics, and weather, and pretty much nothing else. I started out in West Virginia, and there were just so many different stories that we could have done about the community and what people were experiencing, specifically white poverty and a community that has really felt left behind. So after West Virginia, I moved to Greenville, and it was similar in terms of crime, politics, and weather. And then Detroit, it was similar as well, but fortunately Detroit has a lot of diversity, and race was the center of a lot of discussions. And that was the first thing that surprised me when I moved to Detroit, just how open people were with race. So race was always applied to the conversations and stories that we did in Detroit. But until I got to ABC, I never felt that stations really appreciated covering diverse communities. My station is wonderful. At first, I was like, okay, we're doing a little too much, because I was just not used to it. But I'm just fortunate that if I pitch a story, if I write a story, I don't have many editors saying, no, we have to go from it for this perspective. And my station has a lot of, we have Blacks, we have Asians, we have a lot of different ethnicities, races within the station. And I think they really lean on that. So we're doing some excellent work, and we are pretty much open about covering race even before this race and culture beat. And that's something that I appreciated. And I want to piggyback off of what Natalie said about centering whiteness. I remember in Detroit, after Mayor Kilpatrick was, I think his trial had ended, and my news director said, get suburban reaction. I knew what suburban reaction meant. It meant get white people. So I went to a Black suburb and got all Black people. My news director didn't say anything, but that's how you change the narrative, by changing how people think of when they think of a soccer mom. You find a Korean mother. Right. Yeah. So I try to work the system in that way by using my contacts within different communities to change the narrative of who can be what.
Yeah. That's so smart, because I used to run into that in Detroit. It could be some big thing that happened. I remember even being told, we want to, like, what are people at suburban dinner parties saying? Like, that's who we're trying to reach. And that's so smart. Like, okay, you want suburban coverage? I'm gonna give you suburban coverage. I'm gonna go to Southfield. I wish I had.
That's where I was.
I should have thought about that, but it was just always being told, well, and that was their euphemism. And right. So, Will, what you did was you fought back with your own euphemism. So I think that's a really good lesson for others.
And if they would have asked, we said suburbs.
You said suburbs. I was
in a suburb. Yeah. What did you really mean? Can you provide me with some clarity?
Yeah, and how that conversation goes. Yeah, right. So we're having conversations in Medill around the notion of objectivity versus advocacy, and students are struggling mightily. Our students are really raring to do journalism that makes a change and that has impact. They're struggling to figure out how to do that without editorializing, without placing themselves dead center in the story. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts about the term objectivity? What does it mean to you? What is the conversation about it in your newsroom? How does it factor into your work? And do you get questioned? Because, Black reporters used to get, and some of you alluded to this, used to get questioned all the time about their fairness when they were covering stories related to African Americans, right? So thoughts, yeah, what is the conversation around, quote, objectivity these days, and what does that mean?
I would encourage students to get out in the community. There are so many people working to make change in their community, and you can use those people to center your stories around what they're doing and their voice. I don't think it's ever my responsibility to amplify my voice. I got in this industry to amplify the voices of others, and that involves interacting with people and leaving your own experience, your own box, to provide others with the opportunity to share what they're going through.
I do wonder, and Charles, I'd be interested to hear your take on this, but I do feel a little bit of a shift with the next generation in terms of what journalism might look like in the future. And I don't say it's good or bad, but it might just be different, where there is more of this, advocacy role. I use that for lack of a better term.
Sure.
But what I do say to people is that it's about truth telling. And if truth telling advocates for your particular position, then tell the truth, right? And so by that, the examples I always use for people is like, I look at, Ta-Nehisi Coates or my colleague, Nicole Hannah-Jones. Now, both of them are, at this point in their careers, they're like, in some ways, opinion journalists. But if you look at their work closely, even the stuff they do now where they can use more of their voice, even if you look at the stuff now, it is completely rooted in facts and storytelling. It is completely rooted in the fundamentals of journalism. If you look at the case of reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates, if you look at Nicole's piece on finding a school for her daughter,
Which was a first person piece. That was a first person piece, but yeah.
Exactly. If you even look at her 1619 essay, right, that won the Pulitzer, these are such well-researched, fact-driven stories that she wasn't out there saying, "Oh, I just think that America is, the roots of slavery is still all through America because I think that." She didn't do that. She provided history, context, and data and everything. So if you want to be an advocate for something, you have to do really good reporting. And that's, to me, that in my opinion is the best way to be a good advocate, is to be an advocate for something. Because to me, you can always see through it when someone writes something that comes from a position of like, this is how I feel or how I think, but it's not necessarily rooted in the facts. So that's kind of where I stand on that.
I always tell students there's no such thing as objectivity. So let's just stop with that conversation. There's accuracy, there's truth, there's fairness, but we should embrace our subjectivity because it could be a benefit and it could be a blind spot. And that's why you have editors to help you. I also like to say that journalists tell you not what to think, but what to think about. Mm-hmm. So if you are really passionate about food insecurity, you don't have to be an activist. You could just cover those stories. Now that still means that you have to get various opinions and not just cover the same people in the community. But I also think that younger, and I think we still see this in newsrooms today, that there has to be another side. Like there is no other side to racism. Like they're just some things that are false equivalency. So those things I don't like. There is no upside to segregation. Like there is no upside to these other things. So just making that the baseline is.
But editors will still push for finding like the other side, not the other side to racism, but what do they won't say this, but it's sort of, well, what do the racists think? I mean, what do the people think? And they do sort of want you. And again, we do have an obligation to sort of hear those voices, but how do we place them in context, and how do we do that in a way that again gets at truth? Because ultimately, right, we're trying to get at the closest approximation to truth, understanding that that's a fleeting thing. How do we get to that? Robert, you're dying to get in here. Go
yeah, ahead. I'm jumping. I feel very strongly about this stuff. Well, I mean, the thing about it that I think is really important is, perspective is great. A person should have a perspective. It drives questions, but I think skepticism is also really important. And just because a person comes in feeling that a story should go one way, any reporter can do anything to do something to justify their thesis of the story before they walk out the door. Mm-hmm. I feel that whoever does it, no matter what race, it's cheap and it's a disservice. So when I think about stories, I have the first conversation I always have is with myself. It's, what do I think this is about? Where do I think this is going? And then the next thing I think about is, geez, how can I battle-proof this and test it in every way to make sure I'm right? And that includes sometimes talking to people with really nefarious views. And so when you do a story, you don't just sort of throw them away or say, well, I don't want to have discussions about people who don't believe in racism. And so I'm just going to produce this story as if they don't exist. No, I think it's really important to have those sorts of conversations, understand the perspective, be able to report the holes in it. You know, John's example about what Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates have been able to do is actually looking at the perspective of people who disagree with them and to being able to incriminate those sorts of things. And that's the conversation we need to be having. So even the great advocacy journalists of yore, right? You know, the stuff that we read in the alt weeklies and the Village Voices of the world, that's what they did. So that, I feel that conversation does not really need to change necessarily. Like if you're doing journalism, do journalism. If you say you want to center it around your personal journey, fine, do that. But that doesn't excuse you from not doing the work. And at the end of the day, I feel the conversation, particularly with a generation that grew up exposing themselves to the internet and to the world from very young ages, sometimes before their parents' permission about whether or not they should be on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. For people like that, then yeah, you know, go for it, but still report.
Yeah, can I jump in? I just want to say something like, on this question of giving the other side perspective or letting the other side of racism talk. There's a nuanced perspective here, in my opinion, that like we do have this line to walk in the sense that I do think we do need to show people, we need to hold up a mirror to this country and show you this is the country you live in, this is where you live. Yeah. So there's a sense where you have to balance this, getting perspectives of racists, for lack of a better word, but not doing it to say that there is another side to this issue, but doing it to show this is the country that we live in, and this is real. Like QAnon, these are real people who really think this, who one of whom is in Congress now, right? So there are certain things I think, you know, that we need to walk that fine line. You can't walk it too far to like, quote unquote, normalize it in some ways. So that is a line we have to walk. And I always think about it in this kind, when I used to cover courts, and I'm going to botch this, but I know sometimes lawyers used to want to enter something into evidence, and they would say it's not for the truth of the matter, but it's to speak the state of mind, is sometimes they enter something into evidence, you know? And so that's something like what sometimes people say, it's not for the truth of or falsity of what they're saying, but it's to get to state of mind and get to perspective. So there's that balance to walk, and it's a difficult line.
It is. Absolutely.
And I'm going to add that you know, when I say, you know, both sides, I'm talking more about the false equivalency. It's not about not reporting. Because I mean, I think a lot of us got really tired of hearing Trump supporters in diners. Like that didn't add anything. It was just like, well, we have to get their perspective, but it didn't challenge. It didn't frame it. It was just like, these are, and it didn't even challenge why they were supporting. So there's that. But then I think another way to do it is through policy. So, you know, most people are going to be local reporters. If there is, let's say, an affordable housing issue, you have to talk to the people who are against it. But how do you frame? I think the framing is what's really important. And just, you know, to give an example, because I think students are listening, a couple of years ago, I covered a Confederate ceremony at Oakwood Cemetery, which is on the south side of Chicago. All four of my grandparents are buried there. My best friend is buried there. Harold Washington is buried there. This is a place that I didn't even know had a Confederate memorial. Ida B. Wells is buried there. Yeah. And so there was this Confederate thing, and these were soldiers who died at Camp Douglas. And then so there were some folks who showed up for Ida B. Wells also. So, you know, there was news media there, and I go to the Confederate spot, and this is emotional. I'm like, why are they like, this is awful. And they're wearing Confederate uniforms, and they have Confederate flags on. And I thought this was such a bad interview, because I'm asking the guy, he didn't want to give his name. Like, why are you here? And it's like, how much do I push back? He is not going to change his mind by any questions that I'm asking. Why would he believe me if I say the Civil War was about slavery and he's saying it's not? So I was like, well, I guess I'm done here. I felt stupid. Like, I don't even know how to keep asking questions. But everyone's like, oh, it's a really good story. Like, you just, But then I talked to the head of the Chicago History Museum, who's like, well, I'm the grandson of Confederates, and I would never celebrate that. And all those people are seditious and traitors to the country. So he did the work for me also, but it's like, how much, like, you do want to hear why people are there, but do you lead with them? Do you center the story around them? And how much do you keep? Because I guess I could have stood there all day with him. And I was like, after a minute, like, well, this is done. Like, we're not gonna get anywhere. And the other people didn't want to talk. And, you know, they're never going to believe that the Civil War was about slavery.
Can
Robert,
I just,
Robert, this is your area. You're famous for going into the lion's den and talking to race. So what is that?
Yeah, you know, I, as a person, I do not subscribe to the theory that there were too many stories about Trump supporters in diners, you know, as a person who's done a number of them. But I think there's a way.
I have not heard your work, so that was not a slight on you.
No, I know it wasn't a slight on.
But I think,
yeah.
But I think the framing, like, we can hear from them, but I just felt like it was, well,
I get you. I'm going to supplement what you're saying, because I think the distinction is really important. Now, one of the stories that I go back to was a story that I did in Ferguson, Missouri, after Mike Brown was shot. You know, Ferguson, when you were looking at the coverage of Ferguson, Missouri, you would have thought it was an all-Black city, right? But it's not. Ferguson, Missouri is a third white. And when I told my bosses I wanted to go and talk to white people about Ferguson and Mike Brown, they thought I was crazy and completely missing the forest for the trees. Here's what happened. So once the story that we did was centered around this pizza shop, and it was said amongst the protesters in Ferguson that the pizza shop was racist, and supporters of Darren Wilson, who shot Mike Brown, because they're protesting outside there, and the owner of the pizza shop showed his gun to them. Big thing, they wanted to boycott the pizza shop. Now, a person who went to high school with the owner of the pizza shop thought this entire thing was ridiculous. And he stood in the parking lot with a couple dozen boxes of pizza and said, you know, this entire thing has become a big misunderstanding. I love my Black community. This is all wrong. I'm going to give you free pizza. We can talk about this and end racism right there. Now, why I'm bringing that up is because what that showed was there was a way of thinking about race and racism that was unique and natural to him, right? That it might have been a big misunderstanding, you know, a personal relationship might make things better. And then when the protesters came, none of them wanted that pizza. And that discussion, he was not prepared for. So like, when we talk about people who have different sorts of perspectives, or would be in the lane of folks who, you know, we might consider hideous people, or folks who we would not want to sit in a church pew with, I think it's really important to be able to see them in motion, right? Not to just walk up to a random person and say, hey, what do you think about the fact that Donald Trump doesn't want Muslims in this country, right? But to go to places where they're actually having conversations and being there to observe them and telling the story through that lens that doesn't excuse the behavior, because ultimately, your job, I'm not going to convince someone that racism doesn't exist, but there is a perspective in this country that racism does not exist. And so what you do is you find avenues to tell that stories in places that are natural to them and find ways to contrast it. And that's how you tell this story. So like, to me, I don't feel like there's any nobility in my job trying to convince one interviewee at a time, but I think there's a tremendous amount of respect and a tremendous importance in talking to those people and keeping in mind the reader who's going to learn something and have their eyes open and buy the experience.
And just one thing on that story, Robert. I think you told me the pizza shop story. I think you left out the best part. Wasn't there a part where you were inside and the owner said she doesn't see color, then she pointed to you or something like that?
Oh yeah, well, yes, that did happen. So I walked into the pizza shop and the owner was there, and she says, I'm not talking, which is what I hear a lot. And then she paused and I just kind of waited and she goes, we're not the type of people who we think we are. I don't see color. And then she didn't point to me, but she pointed to the one Black person in the shop and she goes, I don't see you as Black, which
Of course.
how could she tell? I don't know.
Well, so these other folks have the luxury of working. Natalie kind of works in a shorter form too, but John and Robert get to work in a longer form. You don't have that luxury to do this kind of nuanced coverage of race and kind of suss out. So how do you tackle this in a way that brings, perspective and nuance to this coverage?
So with this new role, that was the initial challenge, figuring out how this was going to work. If I'm going to be focusing on race and culture, it's not something that I can usually turn in a day's time if you really want quality work. So in this new role, they're allowing me to have days where I just work on projects. And this was one of those days where I was able to make calls with people in the community. With this job, you can't really rely on the scanner anymore. You can't rely on press releases. You really have to get out in the community and make conversations, virtual Zooms, virtual coffee conversations now. You can't meet in person. But it has been a struggle previously when I was covering for race in general assignment stories. You only have 1 minute and 30 seconds, and then you get the story at 9:45 in the morning, and you have to turn it for 4. And if someone's not available at a certain time, you have to leave out this perspective. So it was always trying to put together a puzzle and create something out of whatever people are available at the moment. So it was a struggle. And I always envy John and Robert when they're able to do these long form pieces and they have days and weeks to work on them and then seeing the final product. And I'm thinking sometimes I only have 3 hours to put together a story.
Robert, I want to turn briefly to campus affairs and your progeny at the Daily Northwestern, who, when we talk about advocacy, they've been under fire from both sides, from the kind of progressive student body who doesn't trust the Daily and feels that their coverage is biased and slanted, but also from the administration, which has and from alums who don't like the fact that the Daily chose not to identify protesters and not by name and to blur their faces so that they wouldn't be identified. Their rationale oftentimes was that they didn't want to expose these students to disciplining by the administration, so they wanted to protect them. I just want your thoughts. Is that their role? Do you think that's the way they should approach these stories? Anybody else can weigh in too, but Robert, since again, like I said, these are your progeny, these are your children. What do you think about it?
I appreciate this entire thing, this entire panel is to make us all feel really old. Thanks for that, Charles. So I think it's a really interesting question, and it alludes to some of the things that John was talking about in terms of generational stuff. I haven't seen any of the pictures that have been blurred, but I'm familiar with the case. And I think as an institutionalist, right? And I say that as in a person whose job was to guard the reputation of the institution. I think the first question that I would ask myself if I were a student was, what's the biggest threat? What's my journalistic purpose? In my time on campus, I think my biggest worry was the infringing of the free rights of the newspaper, the independence of the newspaper, that it would be dictated by things that the administration wanted or things that the city of Evanston wanted. And I would not advise making decisions for fear of what a university administrator would do. So when I hear a rationale that you don't want someone to be disciplined for taking an action of free speech, I actually think it's sort of censoring speech if you blur the face or you don't say this action exists. And in that sense, the university is already censoring you. I don't think that's a really good policy. I think there's probably another side to it, and the other side to it has to do with a larger discussion in media today about what the obligations are about dealing with people who are victims and dealing with people who are in the news. How long, and I think one of the things that we used to do at the Daily, we used to do the blotter where we'd say this person got arrested and all this stuff happened to them. And we'd never follow up on the case. Those things would be there forever. It could ruin a person's job interview, you know, and I think that is something else. So to me, the standard is if you can report truth fully, then report truth fully. If you can't, you might have to make some compromises. But like one thing that I think is a big no-no is to have forces dictate and allow people to be intimidated in that fashion. And if that's what the university is doing, then I think the next move that I would make as an editor is to write about that, report it, and expose those disciplinary cases fully.
I think this is a conversation that is happening at other campuses. I spoke on a panel at Ohio State, and they had a similar issue where people were upset that the newspaper showed the faces of demonstrators. And I think it's a conversation that it's happening in newsrooms across the country as well. In my newsroom, obviously, when we're on live coverage, we don't blur anything. But if we report on some of the unrest, we will not show you any of the faces anymore. And if we show video with faces included, we will blur the faces. My news director sent out a note, I think a day or two after the initial unrest, saying that there's no need to show people's faces. And I think that is the right move, because what does that really add to a story afterwards? So why do you really need to see the faces? But on the other end, we did a story involving, I believe, white supremacists once, and we blurred their faces as well. And there was a lot of outcry, outrage in the community about it. It was just mishandled. But it just seems that a lot of times that people want their views represented. So if they're a part of a group that is in the spotlight, they want their faces blurred. But if another group is in the spotlight, their faces shouldn't be blurred. So it's an interesting conversation. And honestly, I don't know if there's one right answer.
What was the news director's rationale for blurring faces?
She's just said it wasn't necessary. We will show, if police release an image of looting and say we are looking for this person, then we will do that. But we won't just show, if we are doing a story about what happened last year, we won't show anyone's face. But we also changed our policies with mugshots recently, ABC. So if you watch our newscast, we won't show mugshots unless it's absolutely necessary. If it's a huge story, obviously we will cover it. If police say they're searching for someone and this is of public interest, we will show it. But we're not showing mugshots of every person who shot and killed someone, because it's absolutely not necessary. And this is on the internet, and we had a lot of, our station brings in different people from the community, and a lot of our Black audience would tell us that we're fueling stereotypes. If people are tuning in from the North Shore and all they're seeing is Black people committing crime, Black people doing victims of crime, that's going to change the perspective of how they view their city. And to be honest, it's only a small slither of a lot of these communities. It's just 1%, even smaller than that, committing these crimes. The rest of the community, law-abiding citizens trying to go to work, get their kids to school, make dinner at night, get them to practice. And we're covering the shootings and killings every day.
That gets me to another issue regarding stories about, say, icons in the Black community who find themselves in trouble of some sort or another. Natalie and Will, I'm specifically thinking of Father Pfleger, who is not Black, but is certainly an icon in the Black community, a Catholic priest who was the longtime parish priest of St. Sabina, a revered church on the South Side, has now been accused of some predatory behavior from years past. Many people in the Black community feel that the reporting on that is kind of stereotyping and piling on, and again, tearing down an icon. I was just wondering, some people feel that, you know, the media is just sensationalizing these accusations, which, you know, have not been proven? Do either of you, have either of you covered that story? And do either of you have?
I have not, but I just remember when I first found out about it, it was very surprising because as a local news reporter, you really have close relationships with people you see weekly on different stories. I have Father Pfleger's cell phone number. He has my cell phone number. He would pitch story ideas with me. I would try to ask him what's going on in his community to gather story ideas. I think we have a responsibility as journalists to cover what is happening and putting it in the proper context. So giving a Father Pfleger or whoever the icon is at the moment the opportunity to speak and share their story, and giving the accusers the right to share their stories. It's the responsibility of the viewers to make the decision. But I do think we have a responsibility as well to put it in the proper context, and how often should we cover it? Should we get more information and try to vet some of the facts before we put things on air? I think that's a discussion worth having, and every newsroom should have before we put anything on the air.
Natalie?
I was editing that week. So we were just covering like the breaking news, so didn't do anything in depth. But I mean, it's tough. I mean, I don't recall seeing any coverage that I thought was sensational. I think most of the coverage was actually pretty sympathetic because of the people who were speaking out about it.
Yeah.
So I think we were debating where to put a line in or which version it should go in. There is I'm messing up the facts, but some sort of group here that helps survivors, and maybe they can talk about the percentage of like how often this happens. Because you have to check yourself, okay, this is Father Pfleger, but what if this were a white priest in a suburban parish? How would we cover it? And so you have to check yourself, and you can cover the people who are saying this is a setup. The archdiocese doesn't want him. Right. You know, he has support, but you also have to be fair, and that's where the gut check comes in. Well, if this wasn't Father Pfleger, how would this be covered?
I want to, we're coming up, but I want to open the floor for questions. If there are folks who'd like to put their questions in the Q&A, do so. And there are a couple of them here that I will read. Let's see, one says, during the past 4 years, white supremacists have seemed emboldened to share their views, which were previously considered taboo. Are we heading towards a racial conflagration spearheaded by violence towards people of color? I'm not sure what that means even. Yeah.
I will say that it's beneficial for white supremacists to speak up. I think that's a conversation that was lurking in the background. And I think it serves our viewers, the public, to understand who lives amongst us. So I appreciate that it seems like people are more out in the open talking about race, because people need to know what people are thinking in their communities.
Yeah.
I want to plug my colleague Odette Youssef did a podcast, Motive Season 3, that started last summer, about the white supremacist movement and its roots in Chicago. And her knowledge is so deep that she predicted what was going to happen at the Capitol. She didn't think it was going to be at the Capitol, but she knew that was going to happen. But we have conversations on our team, like, how do we keep this coverage going? And one thing we've talked about is not doing profiles of people, because these people cycle out.
Right.
Someone else comes in and they're replaced. So you have to think about it from a movement perspective and not a personality, which might sound counterintuitive. Like, well, the person's involved, but they push these people out. And so too many profiles of people gives them credibility and it uplifts. And it's that line, how do you tell the stories without just giving free reign? And so we talk about it more like a movement. I mean, of course, there will be exceptions, but what is the action that is happening? Right. What is the movement? Not, oh, and this is how they're dressing now. And they're, like we have the Richard Spencers, we have the people who are using a different approach and try not to be cultish personality with it.
Yeah, exactly. There's a question about, probably for the Chicagoans, but I think Robert and John, you may have encountered this too. It's about school reopening. Someone wants to know, how do you cover school reopenings from an equity lens, given the intersection of health disparities, educational achievement disparities, the digital divide that comes into play? What are we asking the right questions of school administrators, teachers, unions, and other stakeholders? What do you think about the coverage of this issue? I don't know that any of you have had much of a piece of that, but yeah, are we covering that with an equity lens?
I've been watching the coverage and listening to the pitches and our story decisions during the meeting. I haven't really covered the story directly, but I can say that I think people are asking the right questions. At my station, we've done a quality job of covering a variety of perspectives. People's access to the vaccine. Will they take the vaccine? Communities hardest hit. Do they want to return? Why or why not? I think the hard part is that we get a press release every other day. Black moms for schools to stay closed. Black moms for schools to stay open. And so I think what is missing sometimes in the coverage is that people of a variety of backgrounds have several different opinions. And so it's not just one opinion. It just depends on who you ask, their economics, where they work, where they live. So it's really a hard subject to cover because we can't always put people in boxes. So I think that's what I'm getting at.
And what was hard, I am not covering it, but I have a kid who's going to start kindergarten in CPS in the fall. So as a parent and as a resident, this has been very painful to watch, but it's been a really odd equity. It's kind of turned upside down because my perspective is just because white parents want something doesn't mean that it's not equitable. Like, I am not concerned with white parents who want, I don't believe the argument, well, white parents want this, so it must be bad. I really don't think that the numbers have been talked about enough, how bad it is for Black kids. And it's turned into this political fight, between two political entities. And I actually think the equity message has gotten lost. Now, obviously the story that's really there is trust. Yeah. Yes, white people always trust institutions more. And it's showing how Black people really don't trust, but the equity is being used on all sides. But here's a time where just because white people want something doesn't mean it's bad for everybody else.
That story's been covered too much from a political lens and not so personal. Even when we talk to families, it still isn't drilling down enough, from my perspective, into the effect that this is having on everyone. It really is still about the teachers union versus City Hall to a large extent. Yeah, Robert.
And
I agree with
this power. Sorry, Robert.
I agree with that from a national perspective as well. It's, coverage of the coronavirus in itself has been really stunning to watch, because you see constantly that the default of covering issues about equity goes to, all right, what's wrong with Black people? So you see the numbers of infection rates going high in the beginning. You say, oh, well, it's because Black people aren't social distancing, when in actuality, it's a really big socioeconomic stew of systemic problems that have played out over the past, 2 centuries. And then with the vaccine, you saw the same thing happening in real time again. Black people don't want to take the vaccine because they're too scared and they distrust the government. Well, that's true, but also there are the systemic issues in terms of access and going to schools and things like that. So one of the things that I think is really important about this discussion in general is that whenever we discuss issues of diversity, it's to what John was saying earlier. There's just a sense that this story should be incredibly simple. When race and racism are factors in lives, sometimes the defining factor maybe, but really a factor among factors. And I think trying to get into the meaty story requires a lot more. It's a lot simpler to pit one against the other because that makes intrigue and you can get your nice quotes and whatever. But the true story is actually out there. And I don't think a lot of people have done it particularly well.
That gets us to one of the stories in the Q&A, and that is what stories are not being covered enough. I mean, what are the stories that you think we're missing?
I personally think the economics, the financial situation of families. I haven't seen many stories where reporters are in the kitchen with families as they try to navigate, are we going to pay this bill? Are we not going to pay that bill? How are we going to afford food? How are we going to afford medication? A lot of families across the country are struggling right now economically, and that brings in the conversation of the stimulus. So I think there should be more stories talking about how families are coping at a personal level, and why policy decisions are so important.
I was gonna say, I say this at the risk of like shooting myself in the foot because I'm like, maybe this is my job to cover this more, but like, I don't think we do stories enough that really break down differences between racial minorities. Because for the life of me, I kind of hate the term POC, people of color, in one sense, because it just assumes that, oh, well, there was an Asian person on this, so that must be good with the Black folks, right? I mean, like, no, and I feel like we simplify it way too much, not to mention what I've said already, which is among Black folks, it's already very complicated, right? But like this whole labeling of people of color, like I did a story once about a law firm. They were one of like the top white shoe law firms in New York, and they had this new partner class. It was like 2 or 3 years ago. It was like 11 new partners, and all of them were white men, except for like there was one white woman. But one of the guys was from Spain, so they tried to loop the Spanish guy in under people of color. Oh, and they said that, and also one was LGBTQ, and so they tried to loop that all. Like it's just like we need to get serious that like that there are these differences among races, and like I feel like I need to do a better job of finding smarter ways to get at some of those differences, some of those tension points even, and kind of highlight and expose those a little bit more.
To add to that, I think one of the pitfalls in talking about this issue is that we sort of simplify the answers going out and talking to people. And I think the larger challenge here, right, is to not think of race as a human interest story, going out and sort of telling something, that's something emotional, but actually looking at race as an accountability story, that things happen to certain minorities in this country because of long-standing, deep-rooted things that affect them. And whether or not the person you're speaking to can articulate it in that fashion, it's not negligible, but it's not as important. I think one of the things that we really need to do is that if we're going to, make our coverage and make our news pages and our websites more multi-culti, like the optics are great, everyone loves Universal, the colors of Benetton or whatever. But I think when we're talking about the actual issues that can help people understand what's going on in the country, that level of depth is what we should actually be addressing.
Will, your former colleague, Stephen Lewis from WLS wants to know, how do you get stories?
What's up, Stephen?
How do you get stories about race as the lead story versus the daily crime story? How do you convince producers that that kind of story is more important and impactful? That's very interesting coming from a former producer, but yes. Well, how do you do that? How do you convince producers to do that?
And that is a struggle, and something that I'm working toward. Is on my list of things to try to accomplish, to make sure we're covering race and it not be a story that's buried in the newscast. If the 4:30 newscast, some race stories should be at the top. It shouldn't be at 4:38 or 4:42. So that's an ongoing battle about what is news, and I think that's going to take a long time to change. Local news, we're stuck in a format. Weather, start with weather every day, no matter what is going on. So, Stephen, as I know you're a former producer, so I will take your tips if you have any to how to twist producers to make sure that some of my stories are the lead.
And Professor Greenwell, my colleague, wants to know what one thing could newsrooms do to execute fairer coverage of Black communities?
Hire better.
Yeah, that's a good.
And hire into leadership positions too.
Yeah.
That's very important. Go ahead.
Also hire smarter white people. I think one of the big failures of newsrooms is that they're hiring white people into the newsroom that have no experience covering communities that are not like their own. And I think it's malfeasance.
I think it would be beneficial to have someone in the newsroom just focus on looking over scripts and seeing if we have bias in our scripts and making sure we use the appropriate language. I can speak for local news. We have so many shows to fill, and sometimes those stories make it on air a couple minutes before people see them. So it would be good to just have another face in the background, just trying to make sure that we're putting everything in the appropriate perspective, appropriate context.
Can I say one more thing? Because we're kind of living this right now at the New York Times with everyone knows the Donald McNeil situation where he had a now former reporter who said the N-word on a trip in Peru and has since left the organization. But one thing I think that should be done. I was having this conversation with an editor, and I wanted to and I kind of suggested this, but I feel like we don't really know each other as colleagues. And if there's some way to facilitate a better understanding of where John Eligon comes from, where Robert Samuels comes from, who we are, and our white colleagues, where are you all from? What is in your life? We do these, mandatory trainings where we're bringing these DEI experts, but to me, there's no substitute for just getting to know your colleagues on a human level and understanding that difference. That's how you really understand difference better and where people come from. And I say that very personally because I got into a bit of a crap storm when I tweeted out something a couple weeks ago that some of my white colleagues took exception to, and they jumped to such quick conclusions about what I meant by that. Whereas for me, it was obvious what I meant. And I think most Black people who've had the experience, who've lived a life, working in a white professional world or going to a predominantly white institution like Northwestern, have the same concern, which I essentially voiced the concern about, always wondering what white folks are thinking about you. And suddenly I was accusing them of all being racist behind my back. But no, there's so much stuff in between that. And this is if you understand where I come from and what my experience has been being in an all white high school, being in a mostly white university, being in a mostly white newsroom, if you understood that, then I wonder how that could change the way you then go out into the world and cover, people like me or, people who are not like yourself. So.
This is going to be our final question. I think it's a good one to end on, and it comes from one of our viewers as well. Given, we're at this moment in time where there are these new beats, like Will's being formed, focusing on race and social justice and civil rights. Do you think this is just a moment in time, or are these beats, is this coverage going to be, for lack of a better word, integrated or institutionalized, or is this just, for lack of a better, flavor of the month? Will this too pass and we will move on to something else? What are your projections for the future of this kind of coverage, or what do you hope will happen for this kind of coverage? And I'd like everybody to take a pass at this.
That was a big concern of mine when I applied for this job. I was worried that after a few years, the conversation will be on to something else. And it is a gamble. I don't know the answer to that question, but I hope we get to a point where stories of race, everyone's doing them, that everyone's thinking about race in their reporting. And I think that would be very beneficial if everyone had that mindset, instead of just doing stories and not thinking, hey, I wonder, how does this policy break down or impact people based off of race?
Robert?
Yeah, the way this conversation, the conversation in newsrooms has gone has troubled me. And it troubled me from the beginning because I do think there's often a reaction to whatever is happening. And, in a world where not every place is profitable, like, I work in a news organization that's profitable, which boggles my mind. But in a world where that doesn't happen, what happens again when advertising shrinks and cuts need to be made? To me, I think there's a larger question about translating this conversation to the fact that we're really just talking about good journalism here, like what I was talking about, universalizing the actual issues that I talk about. Like the idea of looking at systemic problems, accountability, of trying to get sources who think differently from you. These are like the fundamental things that come with our obligations with the First Amendment. And instead of thinking of it as a response to the life and the death of George Floyd, I think it would be better to broaden the thinking to think of it as a long-standing institutional failure that needs to be corrected. And as happy as I am that, the Post hired at least a dozen people for jobs looking at the intersections of race and insert other title, all that's to the good. More people are great. But at the same time, I think we need to move into a world where the gaps between those things are lowering and decreasing to the point where we get to a meeting and you can have two Black people in the same room with fundamentally different ways of viewing a story and seeing both of them as palatable things that you should do.
John?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One position that I actually had, even at the time when I first got onto the race beat, was I actually didn't think it was necessarily the best idea to have race beats, because I think that race should be something that all reporters should do, should be able to do well. Certainly if you're covering, business, certainly if you're covering, sports, if you're covering, anything like race is a part of every story, right? So to that extent, like I would hope that it would become integrated in a way to where you don't need to say someone's the intersection of race and business reporters, like Robert was saying, that they hired a bunch of those intersectional reporters, and even my job, in some ways, like covering race, so on the one hand, I think we are, there is this reckoning happening. I would be a fool to predict like whether it has staying power, because I don't know, like I would like to hope so, but we've been disappointed many times before. Wouldn't be surprised if we weren't. But the way I would like to see it done is not necessarily that we have to hire race-specific reporters, but it just becomes part of that literacy that we all learn. Like I mean, think of other communities. I've covered so many communities before that I'm not a part of. I've done stories about people who have different different abilities than me, different sexual orientation than me, and I've had to go in there to really learn as much as I can about their experience and understand it well. So I think that as Robert said, this is reporting. So I would hope that race would just be another one of those things that everyone can kind of have those tools in the toolbox and can cover it well. And I hope that that's the direction we end up going in.
Natalie, you have the last word.
I think that this will be a trend because we've seen it over the decades, so there's no reason why this wouldn't change. But that said, I've had people at other public radio member stations say, well, maybe we shouldn't have a race desk. Everybody should be doing this. And I think that our team gives specific expertise around housing, immigration, demographics. It's not just this amorphous, oh, you're covering race. But everybody in my newsroom has to be thinking about it. Like, how can you cover Chicago public schools and not think about race? How can you cover criminal justice? So I think that the moment that we're in now is a way to get these things baked in. So even if some of these positions go away, let's say through attrition, that you have people. I mean, I think it's really important that somebody like Robert is covering politics. Like, the best and the brightest on race should be covering politics in this country. So I think it's both, and it's making sure that we're using this moment. So I think that there is a better understanding, at least a little bit, on what institutional racism is, what systemic, like what are all these forces, and so capitalizing off of that.
Well, thank you all very, very much. You did live up to the billing. It was a very engaging conversation. At least I enjoyed it. I hope the folks who are on the line did as well. I want to thank you all for taking the time. You really do make Medill incredibly proud. I'm so proud of each and every one of you. You just are shining examples of sort of the best and brightest that Medill has to offer. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you, the viewers, for joining us on this line, and stay tuned for more Medill programming down the road. Everyone, have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good seeing you, Charles.